Oh, Soph, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to chat with you. You've just released your book. Tell me, how's the week been?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on. It's so nice to meet you. And secondly, yeah, A Manual for Being Human came out on the 8th of July. And someone asked me what was the most unanticipated thing that happened during this time that I really loved. And what made last week so utterly incredibly special wasn't just that this book went out into the world. It was the amount of love and support I received from friends, family, people I've never met before on Instagram. It may sound silly. You might assume that people would be kind to you when a book comes out, but actually in the UK, people are very funny about success. People are very funny about big steps forwards. We have big, tall poppy syndrome here, which I think you also have in Australia, right?
Yeah, we do that. Yeah.
Yes. So the idea that you're not meant to grow kind of too fast or too big because people will cut you down. So I was kind of nervous actually about the book coming out in case, I suppose I was undermining my own happiness because of that tall poppy syndrome. But people were so lovely, wonderful. There was so much excitement. I did so many interviews last week that by the end of it, I honestly just spent the whole weekend in bed, not just in bed, like with a mask over my eyes and kind of earplugs in, trying to decompress in utter silence and darkness. But it was just such a great week.
I'm so happy that you just had that recharge time. And now it's like Monday morning, fresh and ready to go. And just for those who are listening, Sophie's surrounded by flowers and obviously things that she's been sent as congratulations, this milestone. So well done, lovely. That's huge. And I could only hope to do that one day myself. So very, very inspiring. Now, when it comes to, the idea for this book, and when obviously you are a psychologist, you've lived this. Where did this idea start? Did you always know you wanted to write a book?
That's a funny question because on the one hand, I've always heard people say everyone has a book in them. And I remember years ago thinking, I'm not sure I do, mainly because the size of the task seems so big. But actually, on the other hand, I suppose I'd always hoped I would create something that would share more than the basic psychology with the world. Because when I was very little, my grandma, she had this book. I don't even know what it was called, but it had the answer to absolutely everything in it. You'd fall over and I don't know, tear a hole in your jeans. Someone would make gravy and it would be too greasy. Someone would spill ink on some kind of special fabric. She'd be like, don't worry, darling. And she'd go and get this book. And in it had all the answers, how to darn clothes, how to get ink stains out, and how to use ice cubes to remove grease from gravy.
Wow.
So I know. It's quite an extraordinary thing to learn. But so as a kid, I was like, okay, Granny has the answers. And then as you grow up, you realize there are pretty much manuals for everything, aren't there? So, in the UK, we have Haynes manuals for cars. I'm someone who's quite a keen crafter, or have been in the past in terms of sewing. So you can get books and patterns for pretty much everything you want. But there's not really ever been a book that talks you through the lived experience of being human. And at the age of 18, I fell from being cocky, a cocky teenager who believed nothing could go wrong, to someone who was having panic attacks, didn't know what they were, and thought my life was over. I really didn't know where to turn. I didn't know what to look up. No one around me seemed to know what was happening. The only reference that I had that could make sense of my experience were those terrifying older films. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is way before my time, but I'd seen it. So I was like, that's the only example of people struggling with their mental health I've ever seen. And everyone within that film is constructed as mad or bad and that their life is over. So I was like, that must be me too. It's not a sad story. I eventually got the right support. And after I overcame the panic and realized I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving, I was like, right, I have to learn everything there is to know about psychology, not just to understand me, but so that once I've learned as much as I can share it in the public domain, because no one should ever have to feel the way I did at the age of 18, when that information doesn't need to be kept behind therapy room doors. It doesn't need to be kept in the ivory towers of academia. It doesn't need to be in dusty old textbooks. We could have learned the information I learned about anxiety when I was in school. Rather than learning sin, cos, and tan, I could have learned about the fight or flight response and breathing exercises. So I did an undergraduate in psychology, a master's in neuroscience, a doctorate in clinical psychology, and then was like, right, that book, that manual for being human that's going to cover all of the lived experience, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write it and share it.
Amazing. And so this is the culmination of all your experience. And after all, there was a book in you.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I was totally wrong.
It must have been so incredibly isolating, that experience, just when you described, like, literally not having any other examples in your life or around you of like what struggling and what not waking up and smiling every day and being like okay with life. It's crazy, these expectations that we put on. We almost have this like idea that we should be a certain way, like we should be happy all the time, and it's just so unrealistic.
Yeah, and also it's very much of our time. So now most of us have grown up being told exactly as you said, happiness is the only emotion we need to strive for, which actually sets us up to fail. As we'll talk about this later, but emotions of all kinds are what helped our species survive. But why I say this is something to do with where we are in time. If you think back to the 16th or 17th century, at that period, sadness was the emotion that was thought to be de rigueur, the emotion you were meant to strive for, because it was thought to make you more productive. So no joke, there is a version of a self-help book from the 1600s, a medical almanac, that lists all the reasons that you could think of to be sad so that you could conjure up sadness in your day-to-day life in order to be more productive.
Wow. What is the logic behind that? Because I can understand it from that like struggling artist perspective. Like we go into the depths of our sadness and our despair and the melancholy, and we kind of come up with some kind of epiphany and beautiful idea in the pain. Do you know what the logic is in that?
No, I mean, it's just fascinating. I mean, on the one hand, we do know that, for example, the emotion anger does make us more creative, which I think people rarely know.
No, I don't know that.
And that's thought to be because one of the reasons is anger is a driving energy, right? And when you can harness that driving energy and funnel it into something that you care about, you can really come up with new and exciting ideas. I think the thing that's very interesting about sadness is it shows that it just depends on what society thinks is good or interesting. And once society has an idea about something, it will tell you that that is the emotion you need to strive for and everything else needs to be forgotten. And it just so happens we're in a time where happiness is the emotion we are told is most important.
Wow. Okay. So from this lens, we get to kind of go, because we sort of say there are positive emotions and there's negative emotions. And what you're alluding to here is that our perception of the emotion and what it means, even if it's uncomfortable in our body, is really the key element here.
Yes. Yeah. Without all of the emotions, we simply wouldn't have survived as a species. It was anxiety that had our ancestors doing that weird startle moment that you and I am sure do too, where say they heard something rustling in the bushes, they would have gone completely still. Their eyes would have darted from side to side. They would have opened their mouth so they could hear better. Their brain would start flashing up almost like on a movie screen, everything that could possibly go wrong. This is yours and my experience of anxiety, right? When we start predicting all of the terrible things that could happen. So they would start thinking about everything that could possibly go wrong in order to problem solve their way out of danger should it befall them. It was fear that had their legs running them away from that danger should something have come out of the bushes. And it was anger that rose up in their body, causing them to turn towards danger, to either fight to get their precious resources back or to fight for their lives. So yes, happiness is a brilliant emotion. It was, for example, the feelings of interest and arousal that got our ancestors to turn towards anyone they could procreate with, probably happiness too. But it is these emotions that we construct as negative, in inverted commas, that really helped our species survive and that keep you and I alive today.
Mm. And it's kind of like when you think about when you're blissfully happy, when you've been at
Mm.
at a day spa all day and you're just like, everything's been taken care of. I'm wonderful. There's something kind of useless about it at the same time. Like we don't do much when we're happy. We don't better our lives. We don't want to like save the world or, you know, or create something meaningful when we're happy. We just kind of are happy, right?
Yeah, and I suppose it's interesting though, because we come full circle now, because actually there is something incredibly useful about being content,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, yes, in terms of productivity and creativity and maybe in inverted commas making the world a better place, happiness isn't perhaps as useful as driving energies of anger. You know, if you're fighting injustice when you're feeling happy, it might not be as, you might not be striving as hard as when you feel angry. However, actually it's when we feel happy that and relaxed that the stress levels in our brain reduce and we're suddenly able to think more clearly. And likewise, I think we live in a society that tells us our worth is based on our productivity and what we create in the world. But firstly, that's not true. And secondly, there's this brilliant book by Jenny Odell called, what's it called? Resisting the Attention Economy, How to Do Nothing. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I have heard of that.
It's fantastic. In that book, she talks about how the only things on this planet that proliferate or like grow without any check are tumors and basically weeds, right? You know, like Japanese knotweed that you can't get rid of. Yet we expect ourselves to grow in that way. And by doing that, we put ourselves through an unbelievable amount of pressure. We forget to look around us and see what's here and truly enjoy the life that we have. So, whilst happiness isn't the only emotion we want to strive for, all of them are important.
Mm.
I think there's a side of happiness that few of us realize we could make the most of. We're not looking for that, oh my God, I'm so overwhelmingly happy. We're looking for those moments where we're like, life is good right
Yeah.
here, right now, and I don't have to change a thing.
Yeah. Even though maybe I was really angry yesterday or woke up feeling anxious today, that's okay. I can feel
Yeah.
okay about everything. Do you think is the key having a sense of detachment from whatever emotional experience is passing through? Like, oh, this is just an experience. Is that how you see it?
Yes, 100%. And I suppose detachment detachment is an interesting one, because I know people who are detached from their emotions in a very negative way, as in
Yeah.
out of touch. Yes.
Yeah.
But you've nailed it, right? It's this idea that if we can recognize that there's no such thing as a good or bad emotion, if we can understand that all emotions have purpose and therefore welcome them in, also whilst remaining curious, because sometimes emotions like anxiety can trick us. If we can do that from a position of observation and curiosity, so that to me is detachment, right? If we can use mindfulness to observe and allow everything in and allow everything to pass, we will stop feeling so overwhelmed and so derailed by our emotions day to day.
Mm. It's almost like in that moment of stepping back and observing, we get this sense of, oh, I'm capable of letting this move through me and
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
can
going
cope
to die.
and hold it. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think we're in an interesting time. You know, one of the reasons I wrote a manual for being human is right now is because we are talking more about mental health. But what's interesting is people are saying, oh, I'm really trying to get in touch with my emotions, or we're allowed to talk about emotions now. But actually, very few people have written about what emotions truly are. So in a manual for being human, one of the many chapters, because it really does cover everything that we experience in human psychology. In one of the chapters, I focus on where do our emotions come from? How do you recognize when it's tricking you? How do you know how to let them in? And what coping skills are you using right now that seem like they work, but end up kind of biting you in the bum in the long run?
Yeah. And so, what are these emotions? Where are they coming from?
Well, this is the most exciting thing, I think. So most of us think that emotions arise in response to what happens in your environment. But actually, neuroscientists now believe it's the opposite way around. So for example, your brain 4 times a second is scanning the environment to see if anything has changed. That's how determined it is to prepare you for threat, right? When it sees anything in your environment that's changed, it doesn't wait to find out what that thing is. It predicts what's going to happen. So even right now, you're not really listening to my sentences. You're listening to the words, but your brain is running ahead, predicting what I'll finish the sentence with. Have you ever spoken to someone and you're like, you finish their sentence for them?
Yes.
Yes. That's because your brain is constantly predicting what's going to happen next.
And especially interviewing, I've got to think of the next question at times as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're making continuous predictions. Now, your brain makes predictions, then it simulates what it thinks is going to happen in your brain, and then it prepares you to respond as if that thing is really happening. Now, imagine if you walked into a forest alone at night, or if you were in your house. Let's stick to your house, actually. Imagine if you were in your house on your own at night and you heard a noise outside the window. Your brain would be way ahead of you, and it would be running through all of your memories thinking, okay, what makes sounds outside of your house at night and what should we be afraid of? If you'd seen something, for example, on the news recently, or read something about burglars, an image, but below your level of consciousness of that burglar, maybe hopefully they'd be in a stripy top and they'd be some kind of fun cartoon, would pop up, and your heart would start to race, right? Your body would start preparing you as if the burglar was already there so you could spring into action. So your heart would race, your muscles would get tense, your breathing would quicken, because you're now set into motion that you are going to run or fight for your life. Next thing, either the burglar does appear or it doesn't. Irrespective of that, you've experienced what we call fear. Yes?
Yeah.
Now, based on what happens next, either the fear goes out if you're like, phew, it was just a cat knocking over a bin, or if the burglar appears, you spring into action. Your brain then updates the information it has in its memory stores, such as next time I hear a noise, it could just be a cat with a bin. Yes. Next time you do hear it, you won't be as alerted to such a strong degree. But can you see what I mean? That emotions are physical sensations that arise in your body in response to the prediction your brain makes, so that you will respond and survive any situation before it happens.
Yes. And of course, when we're talking about anxiety, I mean, can that ever be more true than for anxiety?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So your fight or flight response is activated anytime your brain thinks there's danger. And with anxiety, essentially, you become extremely good at over predicting anything that could go wrong. And interestingly, you can then have those over predictions for your own physical experiences. So when I, for example, was having panic attacks, I was so terrified of having another panic attack that I became hypersensitive and aware of my heartbeat. I used to use my 2 fingers against my pulse to check if it had changed. That started a vicious cycle, unfortunately, because I'd think, oh, is it happening? I'd become afraid of my own heartbeat. Your heart naturally fluctuates throughout the day. So when my heart naturally fluctuated, I was like, it's happening, I'm having a panic attack. Suddenly my brain was simulating a panic attack. Suddenly I was responding as if I was in deep danger, and the panic came on.
And so working through the experience of a panic attack, in fact, let's talk about what a panic attack is. I'm sure many of our listeners have experienced one. Many of us don't. It's somewhat of a mysterious thing to people who've never experienced one before. I have experienced a handful. I'm lucky enough to have not had chronic ongoing ones. I know that's part of your experience. Can you break down what's going on in the panic attack and in that cycle?
For sure. So to anyone who hasn't had a panic attack, hearing someone talk about it can be quite mind-blowing, because you simply cannot imagine it's as terrifying as it is. So a panic attack is essentially this kind of acute, rapid activation or overactivation of the fight or flight. You go from feeling calm, centered, able to listen, to being convinced that you're either losing your mind, about to have a heart attack, or you're about to die. And essentially, it is what we've been talking about in terms of it is your body preparing you to fight or run, but in a way that becomes totally overwhelming because you don't fight or run. So your heart starts to beat a little faster, thinking you're about to spring into action. Then your breathing changes. Then all of the energy that you are creating is sent to your arms and your legs, because those are what you're going to use to fight or to run. Then the things that you don't need to fight or run start to shift. So for example, you don't need your stomach in a fight. So the blood and the energy is sent away from your stomach in a totally safe way towards your limbs. This is what butterflies are. You don't need your external sphincter in a fight. So that starts to relax and you often suddenly need the toilet. Then maybe your vision changes, because if you imagine that you were in a fight, someone had a weapon, your eyesight would change so you could focus on the weapon. Then your thought patterns change. So rather than thinking logically, oh, what's happening here? It's not just that you're running through all the fears of things that could happen in the future. It's that your brain is suddenly saying, okay, what's happened in the past that helped us survive? You know, for our ancestors, how did I survive this tiger? For someone who's feeling anxious or panicky right now, your brain is now bringing up every example of everything terrible that went wrong in the past. Now, these all sound quite subtle and small when they're low level or happening separately. But for someone who's having a panic attack, it's like being hit by a truck. All of these things happen at once. And it's not just that your heart is now racing, it's that all of your muscles have tensed, meaning your chest muscles have tensed too, because that's where your arms would fly out of, right, if you were to fight. Yeah. So suddenly your heart is racing, your chest is tight, and your breathing is shallow. So you feel like you're suffocating. And your brain is generating every dangerous thought you've ever had. So what's particularly difficult during a panic attack is not just the fact that you're flooded by the most extreme physical sensations and emotional sensations you may have ever had. It's that because we aren't taught about panic when we're little, or taught about the fight or flight in any sense when we're little, for most of us, when our brain is generating what's going to go wrong or what is happening to me, much like me at 18, if it can only grab onto these images of things like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it goes, oh my word, we're dying. Oh my God, I'm now bad or mad. And this is it, my life is over. And so the panic cycle keeps going, or I'm having a heart attack, or I'm in danger. And this feeling basically leads you to hyperventilation, and other very extreme symptoms that are absolutely terrifying.
I think that might be one of the most beautiful descriptions of a panic attack I've ever heard.
Oh, thanks.
You described that so gorgeously with your lovely words. But in terms of someone who is undergoing this experience, is it helpful understanding the process? Do you think that that's something that kind of like helps people because they can see what's happening on that physical level?
Yes, one of the main things that turns one panic attack into many is what we call catastrophic misinterpretation. So the idea that you have a panic attack and because you don't know, oh, it's actually normal that my heart is racing, or, oh, my chest now feeling like it's closing in on my heart isn't dangerous, or my thoughts are racing not because I'm mad, but because my brain's trying to prepare me. When we don't know those things, and misinterpret it as we're going to die, our fear cycle escalates so significantly that we then fear panic happening in the future. And we often lead, unfortunately, to a vicious cycle of fearing panic and panic arising. Once you know and truly understand that every symptom during a panic attack is medically safe and can be explained, this is the first step to moving away from being totally out of control of your panic.
Yeah. So it's almost that understanding my body's doing a normal process, even though it feels really extreme. It's still, nothing's gone wrong.
Yes.
And that, I suppose, allows that detachment, that healthy detachment in the Buddhist way.
There you go. Yes, exactly.
That means
also knowing once sorry.
I was going to say that means the whole experience isn't just going to swallow you whole. If you can have that slight little bit of like, okay, there's another perspective here. Yeah.
Yeah. It feels like I'm in danger, but I'm medically safe. And also once you know that it's a process and you know that it's meant to have a beginning, middle, end, as in see something I fear, respond to that danger, fight or flight system shuts down, then you realize that all anxiety is like a wave. It will reach a crescendo, and as long as you don't fight it, it will go back down the other side. When I say don't fight it, that's for people who are like pro anxiety, as in pro professionals. So when I was when my panic attacks got really bad, I listened to breathing exercises 24/7, and by the end of it, I was honestly like a professional. The anxiety would come on, and I'd be like, bring it on, because I felt so skilled in how to manage it. But when you're kind of overwhelmed by panic or at the beginning of the journey, it can be very hard to recognize that there is a wave and that there are coping skills that you can engage in so that you can come back down that other side of anxiety.
And the words This phrases panic attack and anxiety attack are often used somewhat interchangeably. When those words are used, and can you enlighten on your understanding of whether there's a difference between those two things?
I mean, there is, but to be honest, we mainly use those different words in medical and psychological services, right? So a panic attack is meant to be characterized by this sudden onset and this deep terror. For some people, an anxiety attack may mean, yes, I was extremely, extremely overwhelmed. Anxiety was building up, but I wasn't necessarily in panic. However, to be honest, most people outside of the medical profession do use these terms interchangeably.
Yeah. Okay. Good to know. And so when it comes to this idea of managing a panic attack versus managing anxiety, and you mentioned that anxiety wave, are there many overlaps?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes. Okay. So anxiety, if I imagine an anxiety attack is just the build up, it's the bit before the panic attack. Yes. So they're both exactly the same. They're both linked to the fight or flight is what I mean when I say they're exactly the same.
Yeah.
And at the basis of it, the first step is always understanding what is happening in your body, knowing you're medically safe. The second step is then gathering as many tools as you can to settle and to switch off your fight or flight response, such as a grounding exercise. For people who are just feeling anxious, grounding exercises are useful, but for people who feel like, their emotions are like a runaway train without brakes, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or dunking your face in water, these grounding exercises will help you apply those brakes even when you're feeling overwhelmed. So the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is where you look around you and you say 5 things you can see, then you say 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. But for example, when you say the 4 things that you can touch, you actually touch them and you describe what you feel. When you say the 3 things you can hear, you're really listening for all the sounds around you and perhaps even to your breathing. And you, if you can, describe those kind of sounds. The idea is that when you're in full panic, turning your attention to the breath can feel a little bit too overwhelming. Whereas when you turn your attention outwards to things in your environment that aren't changing and aren't overwhelming, it sends a message to your brain, you are safe. So grounding exercises are kind of non-negotiable if you experience anxiety. Breathing exercises are next, right? The idea that you use the opposite way of fight or flight breathing to slow everything down, to shut down the fight or flight response. And actually in A Manual for Being Human, part 3 of the book, so there's a whole section on panic, but part 3 of the book. So part 1 is trying to answer the question that everyone comes to therapy with, which is, why do I feel this way? Part 2 is the second question everyone asks in therapy, which is, what's keeping me here? And part 3 is how to move forwards. But in part 3, what I would describe as an arsenal of coping skills, it is laid out moving from grounding skills up to the more kind of cognitively loaded skills. So grounding skills, doesn't matter if you're in the red zone, unable to think. Breathing exercises, you need a little bit more control to be able to get there. When we get all the way up to, for example, journaling or values, figuring out what's important in your life and choosing how to live it, we need you to be in a little bit more of a calm state in order to be able to think clearly and access those skills. So it's built layer by layer.
Amazing. I love that system. That sounds beautiful and really clear for people to understand how they can kind of incorporate that. When it comes to understanding where anxiety comes from, why are some of us more prone to this anxiety and others not? What have you come to understand in your experience, in your research and your studies?
Oh my word, the answer, there's so many answers to that, right? So some people will be more prone because of their DNA. Some people will be more prone because they, for example, grew up in an environment that wasn't safe. You come into the world, as in you're born, when your brain is roughly 1/3 of its full development, which means that even though your DNA provides the foundation for your brain develops and adapts to your environment to keep you safe. Much like architects would adapt their blueprints depending on terrain, your brain develops depending on what's around you. So a child who grows up in safety, who's soothed, has a brain that doesn't need to be on high alert for threat. a child who grows up, for example, in neglect or in danger will have a brain that's hyper responsive and will switch into anxiety, fight or flight or trauma very, very quickly. It's a brilliant survival technique, right? Your brain looks for danger so you can avoid it. So it could be your childhood. It could be that anything has happened in your life that scared you, undermined your self-belief, has made you feel overwhelmed. It could be that you simply had the experience of panic one day because you were tipped over the edge in terms of the stress you were managing, and it felt so utterly scary that then it started a cycle of panic. So most of us actually have different routes to panic.
Yeah.
Many of us do. And the thing is, we can make sense of all of the reasons someone struggles. But if you are in the midst of a panic attack, actually the last thing you need is someone to figure out why you're panicking. The first thing you need is, here are the tools that will help you stop panicking. Because when I first had panic, I ended up going to see a therapist who just wasn't the right kind of therapist for what I was going through. And the first thing they asked me was, so tell me about your father. And I was like, what? I'm panicking. I need support, not to talk about that. So the way I see it is, if someone was to come to me for support with panic, we would ground you, help you apply the brakes to the anxiety so that you know you can get through it. And then, and only if you want to, would we look at the reasons why you struggled in the first place.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And so something that people often say to me, Soph, is it's really hard to believe that you can get better when you've lived this way for so long. And it seems like it's really hard. And I'm sure if you Google enough internet forums and things like that, you'll find a lot of stories about people who say you can't get better, or it's always like this and you're just stuck that way. In your experience, what are some things that, or some messages of hope for those people that we can kind of share for them?
Yeah. So one of the great things about being a therapist is we carry the hope for people who can't carry the hope themselves in that moment.
Yeah.
And then we hand it back when they feel ready to hold it. One, the internet is a place that can be very, very useful when you can't access support elsewhere, but can also be a dark and scary place that will tell you that everything you experience is basically going to either kill you or won't go away. So the first thing I would say is speak to the people in your life rather than use the internet to get information, unless you can't access better, quality healthcare. But actually what we know is that absolutely you can change and improve your mental health at any point in your life. Your brain is not set. Your brain is plastic, right? Your brain, the more you practice breathing exercises, the more you practice mindfulness, your brain is literally rewiring in order to set you at a more relaxed state going forwards. Even if your childhood was deeply traumatic and your brain developed in this kind of hypersensitive way, there are things called which we call bottom-up approaches, so that start with grounding you first, that can still help you feel more safe and more relaxed. Now, whilst it is a reality that you can absolutely recover, for some people there are mental health conditions, forms of distress that are long-term and enduring. But even for people who have these long-term and enduring diagnoses, there are things that you can do, coping skills that will help, support groups, communities that will make you feel seen and safe. There are things that we can always do that can help us change our relationship to the thing that's distressing us. And through changing our relationship, we can have a better quality of life and we can know there is hope.
And so just to, reiterate and recap, because I think that's so important. What you're saying is if we change our relationship to, say, anxiety by seeing it as an emotion that has use, it can be normal to experience this, the body's responding in a normal way, we can totally change what the experience is.
Yeah, 100%.
How much control it has over us.
Yeah, the first time I was able to say, bring it on to my anxiety, which stopped my kind of fight against it. Yes, it built up really fast. I was like, oh my God, maybe I can't cope. Maybe I can't cope. And then I was like, no, Sophie, bring it on, bring it on. And then it just disappeared. Because suddenly that feeling of anxiety wasn't exacerbated by a fear that this is my life forever, my life is ruined. Suddenly I changed my relationship to it. So, one of the things about a manual for being human is not only to say, you make sense, look at all these different things that shape you, how you're keeping yourself safe now and how you can move forward. It also says that even in your darkest points, wherever you are in the world, there is always hope of a brighter day. It may not be today, but it certainly will be a tomorrow in the future. And you are not alone in this, and you don't have to be.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. I think we all need to hear that. And just to challenge you a little further for these people who I'm just like trying to talk for them for a moment, because I've had these conversations. When the people who don't necessarily get better, or they continue to stay at a certain level, do you see a difference in some kind of approach they have or something? I know this is very general, right? Because everyone's got a unique scenario versus those who you see a lot of improvement. Is there something that you see different in people who have a higher recovery rate?
I can't tell you what it is that specifically makes someone fall into one category or another. But I would say that, because I do know a lot of people who will have diagnoses for their whole life. And it can be very frustrating for them to hear people say, oh, you just need to do a breathing exercise, it'll go away. Because they're like, are you kidding me? I've been doing it for years and nothing changed. Yeah. So the one thing I will say is that for people who I know who have a severe and enduring condition, or an experience of panic, for example, that hasn't gone away, community is such an important aspect of support. Being surrounded by people who either have similar experiences or who truly get it, who don't just say, oh, snap out of it, or, oh, I thought you've been doing a breathing exercise, why hasn't it gone away? People who can say, I'm sitting alongside you in the dark, I get it, I've been there. And we can also make a quality of life while struggling. You know, Matt Haig is a very interesting writer, a British writer. And he talks about, he's written about his previous suicide attempt, his depression and anxiety. And I think what's really important about him is he's clear in saying, I still suffer with anxiety, I still suffer with depression. And yet I found a way to make peace with it and make space for it. So obviously not everyone will feel like him or be able to say that. But community, people who aren't afraid to say they're struggling too, can help lift up anyone, irrespective of where they are in life.
We don't have to necessarily have an anxiety-free existence to be happy people. Oh, well, there's that word happy again, isn't it? To be fulfilled people.
Yes. Or happier people, right? Happier people. You know, I wouldn't say that I stopped experiencing anxiety after I got support. I learned to live with it. You know, still there were points where I'd get on a bus and my eyesight would totally go. I literally mean it was like a mist descending, or I'd get these really weird brain zaps. But many years later, I was very lucky that the more I learned about psychology and the more I kept putting certain skills into place, that it did actually pass. And I did learn that there were things I could do actually to move forward from it. But yeah, not everyone has that experience, and being surrounded by people who understand, get it, and can support you is absolutely the way forward.
Thank you for that, because I think it's really important that we speak to that as well. That in terms of just understanding where you went from these brain zaps and the blurry vision to that not happening on a visual level. Do you sort of imagine that your brain no longer kind of just stopped using those neural pathways?
I certainly believe that my brain doesn't escalate in the same way anymore. I'm not flooded in the same way anymore. And the fact that I can still say bring it on does mean I have a new habitual response to anxiety. But I also did, after that age of 18, have a few relapses, a year later and then a year later after that. But the more I think as well, this is something I really see in my clinic, if often what happens is someone will come for support in an acute state of distress, will work through the anxiety, panic, or I do a lot of work around intrusive thoughts and OCD. They will have what we might call an improvement in symptoms or recovery period, be feeling really yes, I'm on top of it. And then something will come along that overwhelms them, such as a pandemic. And suddenly they'll have a reemergence of the old symptoms. And they'll think, oh my word, I'm back at square one. And I think what's really important here is that is not a step backwards. It is a brilliant step sideways, that now we then repeat all of the steps we did in step one, in part one. We really prove to you, if you got past it then, you'll get past it now. We double down on everything that we know works for you and add in anything else. And then when someone moves through that kind of second re-experiencing, they go away knowing, wow, if this happens again, I know I can cope because I've done it twice. So sometimes reemergence isn't step back, it's an important part of the step forwards.
Yeah, I love that. That's so beautiful, because the second, right, we think we've failed.
Yeah.
Go into that, because anxiety is very all or nothing. It's very like that anxious thinking. It's like, I'm either definitely getting better or oh God, what's the point? I've stuffed up.
Yes. And the anxious mind will always say, what if, right? So you'll think, I'm doing a really good job. Okay, someone who's experienced anxiety, for example, starts to notice they're having a good day, feeling a bit happy, but then the brain goes, oh, what if this is the moment though the other shoe is going to drop?
Yes. Yeah.
And the moment our anxious mind says, what if, a lot of us just agree with it. Oh my God, what if? Rather than going, no, but seriously, what would I do? So, okay, if the anxiety came back, well, what would I do? Well, I'd then do the things I know work. And then what if it got worse? Well, then I would speak to my therapist again. And then, oh, how would you feel if that happened? Well, then I'd probably feel supported. And then I know the anxiety would go away. Like, oh, okay. So it's very important that we don't just listen to the what ifs, that we know that's part of anxiety. And that if we follow the what ifs to the end, we normally come out with a pretty good outcome.
And just touching briefly on intrusive thoughts, because I imagine there's a similar kind of approach there. The experience of an intrusive thought can be very, very alarming for somebody, because they can literally be things that you just would never share with someone in public. And you just think, if someone knew that I had this thought, they would think I'm crazy, right?
Yes. Oh, dangerous, very dangerous, because most intrusive thoughts are sexually violent, physically violent, religiously violent. Like, they're often the kinds of things that I honestly have people come to therapy who say, I can't tell you what I'm thinking because you'll call the police.
Right.
Whereas actually, if you go back to one of the things we talked about, which is our brain is constantly figuring out what could go wrong. Intrusive thoughts are sometimes as simple as your brain hitting on something dangerous that could happen in your environment that maybe even you could do. The thought is so scary and your brain wants to deal with it that it pushes it into your consciousness. Let's get an example of, say you're in the kitchen and holding a knife. Your brain's scanning the environment for something dangerous. It goes, knives can cut, knives can stab. I could stab. That thought is frightening. Your brain wants you to do something with it. It shoves it into your conscious. If you know that thoughts are simply the stories your brain puts together to make sense of the world and to share with you threats, for example, then you'd be like, I mean, yes, I could stab someone, and that was a very scary thought, but it's very unlikely. And if you breathed, use that detachment that you talked about, the thought would go away and you'd never think about it again. Yeah. But if you have that thought and think, oh my word, I'm responsible for my thoughts. Thoughts are basically the same as actions. Suddenly I've thought something that makes me extremely dangerous. You try and push the thought away. When you do that, your brain goes, they're trying to avoid something. It must be really dangerous. Don't look away. Shoves the thought back again. And suddenly you end up in a cycle where the thoughts get stuck. So intrusive thoughts are very scary. You can absolutely share them with people. Again, obviously there's a chapter on it in the Manual for Being Human.
Who would have known?
Who'd have known? I know, I bloody wrote everything in that book. But if you're experiencing this and you're keeping this as a secret because you're so terrified that other people will find out about it and judge you, there are people who can understand it. One of the things I now recommend to people is, for example, buying a Manual for Being Human and giving that chapter to the people that they know and love so they can understand what they're going through, so there won't be so much judgment, and so that people know how to act in order to stop the cycle of the intrusive thoughts.
Because that can be one of the hardest things, right? Just getting someone to understand what you're feeling. So I love that as a you've explained it for them, so then they don't have to, because it can be so, especially when you're experiencing anxiety, very hard to think clearly and to communicate what you need or what you're experiencing.
Yeah, 100%. And also, I think it's different when it's like, look, a doctor wrote this. Yeah. Right? And I never write in medical jargon. I hope it feels like you're talking to a friend who loves you dearly and has the information you need. So I think it's one thing when you're in an anxious state trying to explain how you feel. It's another thing when you're like, look, someone qualified is talking about this in a way that makes sense to both of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. And now I'm going to have to let you go in a moment, I know, but I've got two more, hopefully quick questions for you. The first one is, what is contentment to you? What are we striving for in life?
Oh, so we're not, I'd say that we're striving to not strive. How about that? That's how I would describe it. I think if we can stop striving for any emotion, if we can stop striving for success, for change, if we can get curious about what is here already and start nurturing who we are already, we will just feel so much more ironically content or happy in our lives. So I would say we're striving to not strive. That doesn't mean we're stopping the idea of growth or progression, but we need to be more human being rather than human doing if we're going to enjoy our very short time on this planet.
Brilliant answer. And of course, those who are listening want to find out where they can find you and where they can get your book. Can you enlighten us, please?
Yes, 100%. So you can find me on Instagram at _Dr Soph. It's quite funny because there's another Dr Soph on Instagram. They have a private account. I have no idea who they are. One day I'd love to meet them. They've been around, I've been on Instagram since 2018. They must be furious. They get tagged in so many things that are for my work. So at _DRSOPH, so at _Dr Soph. And the book, A Manual for Being Human, is available obviously on Amazon, in the UK, Waterstones, and any local bookstores. It's just come out in Australia. It was published by Simon & Schuster Australia, so in Sydney, but I don't know how you buy it there. But Book Depository, for example, does free worldwide shipping no matter where you are. So bookdepository.com, type in A Manual for Being Human. If it says the book is sold out, it's a glitch on the website. Ignore it. Type the title back in or refresh the page, and a copy will be winging its way to you today.
Oh, gorgeous. Can't wait to get my hands on one as well. Thank you so much. All that information is going to be in the show notes so everyone can access that nice and easily. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I honestly have been loving your work and following you for a long time. And one of the things I think that really, sets you apart is how eloquently you speak and articulate these delicate issues in a way that really feels human and makes people feel understood and loved. And I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you. That's so nice. No one can see me, but I'm basically like holding my own face in my hand, grinning, because that's such a nice compliment. So thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me on. I've loved chatting to you, and let's stay in touch. What a treat.
Beautiful. Looking forward to chatting soon. Bye, Soph.
Bye.